up, you guys? The Curious Owl here, and today I am going to be sharing with you guys my November wrap-up. So November was a pretty successful month, I would say, because I actually did a lot of reading in this past month. I got through about 20 books. Many of them towards the second half of the month, though, were DNFs, and they were audiobooks. I think, to run myself a little ragged with my audiobooks where I get through so many of them so quick, and I think that this past month I just kind of burned myself out a little bit with them. So I think I'm going to start going back to maybe doing one audiobook at a time and kind of having a little bit of a gap between audiobooks as opposed to maybe doing them one right after the other like I had been doing the last couple of months. I also this month ended up actually getting myself completely caught up with my Morganville Vampires reread series, so I was very excited. You guys might have seen I did a couple vlogs over the last month for those, and I was pretty impressed with the fact that I actually got myself up to November's pick, and I actually finished it last night. So like I said, I got through about 20 books or so, but I actually completed 14 out of those 20. The other 6 were audiobooks that I ended up DNFing, and it wasn't really anything that, like, they weren't interesting at all. I think I just got myself so burnt out that I lost interest in them very quickly, but they are all books that I do want to actually end up possibly going back to at some other point in time. The amount of pages I got through this month was 1,232, and I listened to essentially 73 hours and 15 minutes worth of audiobooks. I don't know if that's necessarily the most I've listened to an audiobook in a given month. I don't think it is, but still, that was quite a staggering number for me. Like, I wasn't expecting to have listened to that much over the course of this month. I got through 6 books that were physical. I had no ebooks this month that I read, and I listened and completed 8 audiobooks. 6 of the books were on my personal shelf this month, and the other 8 were borrowed from Overdrive. So the first book I completed in November was Feast of Fools, which is book 4 in the Morganville Vampires series. I gave it a 4.5 out of 5 stars. It was actually probably at that point in my most favorite book out of the group. It was really, really good. The most important aspect going in this series at this point is there is a vampire named Mr. Bishop who comes into Morganville, and he's essentially like a bringer of all kinds of havoc and mayhem. And he basically, over the course of about 3 to 4 books in the series, really messes things up for Morganville and causes the entire town to have to try to figure out what to do with him, considering that he could possibly kill everybody there, but it's a really hard thing for them to figure out how to handle because they've never seen anything like him before, as many people had thought that he was actually dead for the longest time. So I thought it was really good. I felt like with Feast of Fools, the whole writing style of the Morganville Vampires had greatly improved compared to the first 3 books in the series, and you can hear some of my more in-depth thoughts in the reading vlogs that I did for the Morganville Vampires catch-up that I was doing, because at the end of each book, I go into more depth about some of the more integrated things about the stories themselves and how they work and everything like that, and what I found to be the most enjoyable aspects of them. The first audiobook I completed this month was The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. I always want to call him Tutton, but his last name's Turton. The only thing I knew going into this one was that it was about a guy who essentially was waking up in different bodies of different people over the course of several days, and he was trying to find out who committed this murder before the end of, I think it was 8 days. It's all for the same day, essentially, and he's trying to find out who has killed this woman named Evelyn Hardcastle, and through it, he finds a lot of interesting things about the kind of dynamics that are going on within this little area, and everything is not as it seems. Like, there might be some points where you're like, oh, this person did it, or this person did it, but when you go into the next body with this character, things completely change, which I found to be really interesting. The only thing I think I didn't care for with this book is I felt like it got a little confusing between the bodies a little bit, because there was a lot of jumping back and forth between different bodies. It wasn't that he'd go through an entire day with the same body and then wake up the next day with a different body. It was a lot of times where if one of the bodies ended up going to sleep or was knocked out or something, he'd jump into the next body, and so on and so forth, until that actual body may have been like killed or something in the course of the entire investigation. So that made it a little confusing at times with jumping back and forth, because it wasn't always told who we were seeing the perspective of. It only went by days, which that I thought was a little more confusing than if you had listed the names as opposed to like the days. I felt like it was just a little little weird at times, but I thought the overall story was really interesting, and it does play a lot on some different dynamics with especially mysteries that you can play with that I don't think I have ever seen before. And really it's just a very unique style that I think Stuart Turton has developed with this story, and I would be interested to see how he continues with other books, if there's going to be another book with the same kind of idea and how he plays with that, or if there's going to be more about specifically this kind of setup that creates the whole idea of trying to find the murderer. Like, there's a whole world kind of essentially within this game, if you will, that is being played. I want to see more of like how that came around, so I wonder if Stuart will ever possibly build more on that with another story within the same vein kind of thing. The next audiobook I completed was Talon by Julie Kagawa. This was the first Julie Kagawa book I read, and I'm actually really happy that I read this one because I vaguely remember hearing people talk about this one when I was a lot younger, and I knew it had something to do with dragons, but I was greatly surprised with how this one went because it was very interesting to see a very different side of what the dragon kind of idea would be, because essentially this is about a set of siblings. They're not really siblings, but they grew up together, so they're considered in a way siblings because they were hatched around the same time. Essentially, they're hatchlings, and they are being placed in a human area to protect themselves because apparently somebody might be coming after them. There are, dragon hunters that are actually trying to come and kill off all the dragons, considering that they are possibly dangerous and all these things. And so these two characters end up, being placed in this area, and they have to essentially assimilate themselves within the human world to try to learn from them and understand kind of how they can blend in really easily within the human world once they have essentially finished their training. But unfortunately for our female lead, who I can't really remember the name of off the top of my head, she falls for a human boy who we find out is actually a dragon hunter who is sent to try to find her and kill her. And it's a really interesting story because you learn a lot about the dragon hunter specifically, as he is one of the main perspectives of the story, and you learn a lot about kind of how a lot of what he has learned in the past is starting to change because of how he has dealt with finding the dragon, and when he thinks he's found her, how she's kind of changed his mind in a lot of ways. Like, it's one of those stories where it's very much a don't judge a book by its cover kind of story. Like, don't judge a person based on what people tell you of them, because you have to kind of find out for yourself about these kinds of individuals, whether or not they're really considered evil, because what somebody has an idea about of one person is not always going to be kind of the more real deal kind of thing. I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars because I think from beginning to end, I truly just was engrossed in the story. I don't even really think I had a favorite part per se. I just remember really feeling so emotionally attached to the story, and then by the end of it I was absolutely heartbroken because of how things kind of panned out. But it makes me really excited to read the next book, which I think that there's 4 books in the series, maybe 5, but it makes me really excited to want to read more of it because I'm interested to see what exactly happens to the main characters, because there's been a major shift in the power dynamics. There is a huge rift that has been caused at the end of the story, and it's going to change a lot of the way that things happen. The next audiobook I finished this month was Eleanor Park by Rainbow Rowell. This is my first Rainbow Rowell story, and why did I have to pick one that absolutely freaking broke me? I don't know. This story was absolutely wonderful. If you don't know anything about Eleanor Park, it is a story placed in, I want to say, like the maybe mid-80s, early 80s, I'm not quite sure, but it follows these two characters named Eleanor and Park, who are in high school. I think they're about sophomore year of high school, maybe junior year, and Park is a Korean-American student. He meets this girl named Eleanor who's new to his school. She is a bigger girl, she has really red curly hair, and she is actually from a really low-income family, and there is a lot that is dealt with Eleanor because the story is split up between both of their perspectives. But Eleanor essentially comes from a really bad home, and Park is kind of from a little bit of a more well-to-do family. They're not rich by any means, but he's much more better off than Eleanor is in a lot of ways. And it's all about really their connection and their friendship that grows, and then their coinciding relationship that grows. And it's really exploring a lot of the different things, especially about Eleanor in particular, like things that she goes through and how Park is trying to get to know her better, but how hard it is for Eleanor to really open up to him because she thinks that she has a lot to lose now that she has someone that she really cares about, and it's been very hard for her to keep him a secret from her family because it is very possible she could end up losing him because her stepfather is kind of a jerk. A lot of the story I think is more so dealing with Eleanor than it is Park, because a lot of the story I feel like delves more into Eleanor's insecurities and Eleanor's, you know, family history and how that affects how she views herself and how she thinks others view her. I kind of like that, but as I kind of think back on it since having had a few weeks away from it, I wish we would have learned more about Park, because there was a lot of things that I felt like were not brought up a lot, one of which was the fact that he has Korean bloodlines. Like, there was not really any clear moments other than maybe the family dinner scenes where we really saw anything to do with his Korean heritage. He could have just been another American kid at that point. But I did end up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars because, again, I felt like this one was really emotionally invested, and I truly really loved both of the characters, and I felt like, especially with Eleanor, I could relate to her insecurities in a lot of ways, but I also I was heartbroken for her because I've never been in her situation, and to even imagine myself in that situation that she was in is really, really difficult because it's just so heartbreaking, and there's so many things that happened to her that I just wanted to pull her out of there and just, you know, give her a hug and just tell her it's gonna be okay kind of thing. Like, it was just very heartbreaking throughout many of her scenes that I just couldn't not have any emotional attachment to her. The next audiobook I listened to was The Store by James Patterson and Richard DeLallo. This is not my favorite James Patterson by any means. I am a huge fan of James Patterson, many of you may know, and this, though, was not one of my favorites. And the reason is because I felt like the whole ending of the story changed everything about what I knew of the story from the beginning, and it kind of just didn't makes sense. Like, I felt like the ending was kind of just like, oh, plot twist, and it didn't really, it just made me more confused than anything, I think, based on what I had read earlier in the story. This is a story essentially placed in a little bit more of a dystopia kind of society, but not very far-fetched by any means, because essentially this is a world where something called the Store, which is essentially like Amazon, has pretty much taken over all of the United States. It's basically the one place everyone goes to for everything, and it is pretty much like this big corporation where if you have nowhere else to go, you can go to the store and have a job there, and you basically get everything from there, and they're pretty much the only thing running the United States anymore at this point, which at this point, I feel like Amazon's not that far behind. This is a story, though, focusing on this married couple who are writers, and they are having a hard time figuring out what to do because a lot of their books are not selling, and it's because of the fact that the way that they want to sell them is not how the store puts out their stuff. Like, the store tends to do a lot of the ebooks and stuff like that, and the traditional publishing is kind of being pushed out to the outskirts of society because the store is the one that pretty much does everything now. And so these two decide to write this expose on the store and try to find out some really interesting information that most people may not know about the store, and they try to find some information that might actually bring the store down a few pegs. And that idea was actually really interesting to me. I really liked that kind of idea. I like investigative journalism and stuff like that, but I felt like at some point in the story it kind of took a weird turn and was not as realistic as I think it would be for the kind of story it was. And then, like I said, the plot twist kind of changed everything that had happened at the beginning of the story and like towards the middle of it, and I just felt very, very confused, I think, at the end of it, that I was just left unsatisfied in a lot of ways. But I think the general premise of it was really good, so I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, but it is definitely not my favorite. I just wish it would have been written a little differently in a lot of ways. The next book I ended up listening to was The Sleeper and the Spindle by Neil Gaiman. This is, I would say, like a reimagined fairy tale is the best way I think I can describe it, because it is. There is influence from Sleeping Beauty and I think Snow White kind of formed into this story, and it's a short story. The audiobook was only like an hour long or so, and it was about how in this world everyone essentially has fallen asleep, and there's some people that haven't fallen asleep, like in the kingdom. The queen of this world and some other people are going to try to find the reason that everyone has fallen asleep, and it was very interesting. I found it to be very, very enjoyable. It was a full cast audiobook, so everybody had different voices. It was really fun to listen to. I just kind of wish it actually was a full-length story. Like, I almost didn't want it to be a short story. Like, I have a really hard time with short stories, I think, anymore, because I'm just so used to reading novels that a short story doesn't always cut it for me. And I felt like this was one of those short stories that didn't cut it. Like, I wanted there to be so much more to the story, but what there was actually really, really interesting, and a really interesting way to combine the ideas of like Sleeping Beauty and Snow White into one big story. So I ended up giving it 4 to 5 stars, and I really enjoyed it. So now we get into the point where I think all of my audiobooks were pretty much DNFs. The first one was Judge and Jury by James Patterson and Andrew Gross. This one I just wasn't really interested in, but the premise of it was really good. I think at this point, like I said, I just started getting really burnt out with audiobooks because I listened to so much back to back to back to back to back over the course of the last 2 months. So it's possible to come back to this one, maybe in the future, I don't know, we'll see. The next physical book I completed was Lord of Misrule, which is book 5 in the Morganville Vampires series by Rachel Caine. This one just, I think in a lot of ways was just really dragging. I felt like some of the chapters were kind of a little bit less impactful than I had imagined, and honestly, I'm kind of starting to forget some of the things I thought about it at the time, because it's been a couple weeks since I have picked this book up, and I've gotten so much further in the series at this point that I'm starting to forget some of the things that I had talked about. But if you go watch the vlog with that I finished this one in, you'll be able to see more of the more real-time thoughts of when I was reading this one. The next audiobook I completed was The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. This is the first book in the series of Unfortunate Events series. Believe it or not, as much as I read as a kid, I never read the series of Unfortunate Events series, and I was kind of upset by that growing up. Like, I wanted to read it so badly, but there were so many other books I was trying to read at the time that I totally had let it slip by me. And I saw that my library had the first book on audiobook, and so I picked it up. It was a very short read. It was like 3 hours long, the audiobook, because the book is so small since it's like a middle grade series. And so I flew through it, and I absolutely loved it. I remember watching the Jim Carrey movie when I was a kid, and I remember loving it so much. Like, it was a really great story. I really liked the idea of it, and honestly, reading this book was like a nostalgia trip for me in a lot of ways with watching that movie, because it was like one of my favorite movies when I was a kid. So I ended up giving it a 5 out of 5 stars because I think for middle grade, it was actually really, really interesting, and definitely lends a lot to some more fantastical elements than I thought it would have, but I really liked that idea of it, and I don't know, I just really enjoyed my time reading it. The next audiobook I completed was God Help the Child by Toni Morrison. Now, I've read a couple of Toni Morrison's works in the past in college, and I've really liked what she's done. I have not read a full-length novel of hers, though, before, and God Help the Child, I think, was a really great one. The idea starts off where we have this mother character who had a relationship with a white man and has this mixed child, and when she's born, the mother kind of resents her because she knows that this child is going to go through so much, and the fact that the mother is going to have to teach her so much throughout her life, it's kind of like weighing down on her, and the father had essentially left and never was seen again. Essentially, the way that this mother had raised the daughter was not the best way. Like, it was very emotionally abusive in a lot of ways, and so the daughter grows up and is trying to live her life. She's got a very prosperous career going on, and unfortunately, though, the person that she starts having a relationship with dumps her out of the blue, doesn't understand what's going on, and so she's trying to find him and track him down to understand what exactly happened. Along with that, there is a white woman that is released from prison who supposedly had sexually abused this main character when she was a child, and it turns out that that was actually a lie, that the girl had only said that because she was trying to get attention from her mother, and she thought that by lying on account of the fact that this teacher may have supposedly hurt other children and saying that she was abused as well, that it would get her some kind of recognition. But when this woman gets released from prison, the main character, because of the fact that she realizes that she had lied and basically ruined this woman's life, goes to try to also find her and apologize, and it basically is a story where a lot of what this main character does is kind of stemming off of the fact that she was in a household that was not what she needed. She suffered a lot of emotional trauma from her mother, and it affects her very much later in life. And it was kind of one of those stories where I felt was really eye-opening, but I will say there were some parts that kind of seemed unnecessary or kind of was just really dragging in a lot of places, and I just felt like at some points I got a little confused with what exactly was going on. So I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars because I really did enjoy it for a lot of reasons, but there were some points that were just kind of, I don't know what's going on. I also then, after that, DNF'd The Woman in the Window by AJ Finn. I actually had gotten through a lot of this one before I finally DNF'd it because I think I was starting to lose interest, and it was because I was getting very distracted when listening to it. So I think this is one I'll definitely pick up later on, but at the moment when I was reading it, I was not very interested in the story. And then the same happened with The Murder House by James Patterson and David Ellis. The premise of this one was actually really interesting because there's like a house in this beach area that a lot of people apparently have died in, and it was very reminiscent of American Horror Story Murder House, and I think that was kind of the idea of it, but there's a lot more going on to it than just that. The next audiobook I DNF'd was The Chemist by Stephanie Meyer, and this was because I purely had no interest in the story. I only picked it up because I had heard that Stephanie Meyer, after her Twilight books, had actually gotten kind of good with her writing, but I got through maybe like an hour of this book and I just couldn't deal with it. There was too much going on. I felt like I didn't understand anything of what was happening, and there was like so much of the story that was happening after something else had happened that I felt like I should have been let in on more, and I didn't get any of it. And I just kind of felt like I was dropped in the middle of something with no idea of what had happened before, and I didn't like it. That was actually the only audiobook where I purely DNF'd it because I didn't like it and I didn't want to listen to it anymore. The next book I completed was Carpe Corpus, which was book 6 of the Morganville Vampire series. Carpe Corpus did much, much better than Lord of Misrule did in a lot of ways. I ended up giving it a 4 out of 5 stars. The only thing I will say I think with this one that I did not care for is that some of the events in this novel were kind of confusing, only because like there was a lot that was going on in a short period of time, and I felt like with this one, I think it was either this one or Lord of Misrule, the chapter lengths in this one were getting extensively longer, and some of the points in the story I kind of thought could have a cutoff weren't given the cutoff that they needed, and it was just sometimes a little bit dragging in some places, but it fared much, much better than Lord of Misrule did in a lot of ways. And this one is kind of the end of the Bishop storyline. There's a lot that happens with the ending of his rule that is brought up and kind of brings the Morganville vampires into a new era, because essentially in this one, the entire town is dredged up. Things have changed. Some people want power and some people are not willing to give up their power. And it's just really, really difficult to find out whose side everyone is on, because there's like 3 different sides of this war that are going on. There's people that are fighting for Bishop, people that are fighting for Emilie the Founder, and then there's a whole group of people that are against vampires entirely, that are trying to rid them completely from this town and take over it themselves. So it's kind of, there's just a lot that goes on, and I feel like there were some great points in the longer chapters that could have been cut down to the next chapter, but it didn't happen. But it was still really enjoyable and definitely a really great way to end off the Bishop storyline and bring in kind of a new era to the Morganville town, because a lot of things come up in this one that are brought up again in the next couple books that really change the way that this town runs, and this is just the beginning. The next audiobook I finished was Lies She Told by Kate Houlihan. This one, I think I had some higher expectations for than what I got from it. This one was essentially about a writer who is living with this problem where her husband's partner in his law firm has gone missing. It's his best friend, and no one knows where he's gone. He's been gone for about a month, and people are assuming he's dead. And this writer is also struggling with, getting a best-selling book, and so she starts writing this story following a woman who essentially is finding out her husband is cheating on her, and she decides to take matters into her own hands and accidentally kills the lover in the story and is trying to cover it up. So the story is essentially following both the writer who is trying to find out more about her husband's friend's disappearance and the actual story that she's writing over the course of the entirety of her investigation, which has a lot of parallels, honestly, with the actual investigation that's happening. But to be completely honest, the ending of the story was really, really a letdown, because there's a lot that happens in there that I wasn't expecting, and to be completely honest, did not really, I think, make sense with what was going on. Like, there was a lot going on about how there were thoughts that the writer was involved with the murder, which would make sense based on what we find out about the actual disappearance of the friend and the relationships that he had and things of that nature. But just the overall ending I felt like was really rushed, and I felt like it was so unsatisfactory that I was kind of just left like, what? Why is that the ending that we got with the story? So it was overall, like, throughout the entirety of it, very intriguing. I was really kept on my toes throughout most of it, but the ending of it just left me so unhappy, so I ended up giving it a 3 out of 5 stars. Then I tried listening to the audiobook of Good Omens by Terry Pratchett and Neil Gaiman without actually forgetting completely that I even have the physical book of it on my shelf. For some reason, I just didn't remember that I had it, and I was so distracted with how everything had gone in the last couple weeks with the holiday coming up and with everything that was going on at work that I had lost complete track of what was even going on in the story. And to be completely honest, I feel like this is one of those stories where it would just be way better for me to read it physically, because there's like 5 different things that are happening, but the main story is following these characters that are an angel and a demon, and all I really got from it in the first like couple hours of it is that there was this baby that was born who was essentially the Antichrist, and he got misplaced, and this demon and this angel are kind of like, we have to find him kind of thing, because now the world is basically going to end, and he is the one that is going to save it, so we have to find him, and it's a big like wild goose chase of trying to find the kid. So that's pretty much all I had really gotten from it. There is a perspective of the Antichrist at like 11 years old and his shenanigans that he develops with his friends at that time. And so that's pretty much all I really got from the story, but I feel like it's one of those books I have to definitely read the physical book, because there is so much going on that for me to read it physically might make a little bit more sense than trying to focus on the audiobook, which was very, very difficult when I was trying to work. The next book I completed was Fade Out, which is book 7 in the Morganville Vampires series. I got through a lot of the Morganville Vampires this month, like I said, and this one goes into a completely different era of the Morganville town, because in this one, essentially Bishop is gone, he's been taken care of, everything's starting to get back to normal, and Fade Out basically takes place several months after the events of Bishop's downfall. The main difference going on with the town now is that the humans and vampires are a little bit more on even ground than they used to be. There's still some things that haven't really changed as far as, you know, the blood taxes and everything that go on in the city, but the humans actually start being able to defend themselves when it comes to vampires coming to attack them unprovoked, and Claire and her friends are kind of starting to see a lot of good changes. However, unfortunately for Claire, she comes up to meet this girl named Kim, who is a friend of Eve's, and she starts to think that Kim is trying to steal away both Eve and Shane from her for some unknown reason. On top of that, they find out that there is this documentary being made by Kim that is essentially about the town, and then when Kim goes missing, they have to find out what exactly had happened to her and what exactly she was working on that could have possibly led to her disappearance. And it brings up a whole can of worms about what is really going on in this town that is completely blown out of the water, and it's just making things so much more difficult for people to actually live in peace. And then on top of that, there is a character named Ada in the story that is essentially the computer that we find out runs the town, and she's trying to kill off Claire because Ada thinks that Claire is trying to steal Myrnin away from her, because Ada and Myrnin had a former relationship when Ada was actually alive. So there's a lot that is packed into this one, and it brings up a whole mess of trouble for Claire. It is not a fun time. This is one of those stories where I thought that for the most part it was kind of a filler story at first, because it didn't seem like there was a lot going on, but the further I got into it, I was greatly surprised, because there is a lot to unpack with this one in terms of what is really going on within the town of Morganville. I honestly, from beginning to end of this one, was really interested, and like I said, once I got through kind of the more beginning parts of it and started really seeing what the whole idea of it was about, started to get really invested in it. But like I said, with all the other Morganville books, you can check out my actual vlogs for them, because I had a lot to say at the end of this one, how much I enjoyed it, but I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars. This one, too, by the way, is starting to get to a point in the Morganville reread for me where I'm actually starting to see a lot of progress with the story itself, and I honestly have gotten to a point where I think I'm going to start actually giving most of the end of these books 5 stars, because they're going to be really good. Like, I'm gonna be surprised if after Ghost Town the books start to get worse, because they have been on a really good upswing, starting with Fade Out. The last audiobook I tried to read this month was Armada by Ernest Cline. So I read Ready Player One earlier this year, and I really enjoyed it. It was a really great story. It was very atmospheric, and a lot of the references to the video games that were mentioned in the story were actually really interesting. Like, it was one of those stories where I was okay with a lot of the pop culture references because it helped to understand the world better in terms of the fact that it was a world that was based in video games, and so to learn more about kind of how these video games came about because of older video games was really interesting. And Armada was kind of the same, except Armada was more present time, and it follows a kid who essentially is like a really great player of this game called Armada, which is like this alien, almost Space Invaders-like kind of game. And it's a little bit more complex than how Space Invaders used to be, with the fact that it's kind of got, you know, more story to it. And unfortunately, the kid finds out that it's actually been a government like training simulator for a lot of people around the world because there is actually an alien invasion happening with Earth, and every person that has played this game has been being trained to take down these real aliens. I was so upset that I didn't end up actually finishing this one because, again, like with Good Omens, I was getting so distracted with like work and stuff that I couldn't fully focus on the book. And so I feel like also with the fact that I listened to so many audiobooks in a row that I was just getting bogged down with a lot of the stories, and I was getting very bored. So this was one of those stories where I really want to get back to it when I can, but maybe I'll pick up the physical book instead because I listened to Ready Player One on audiobook, and I wonder if maybe listening to it on audio, to Armada on audiobook, may have not been the best way to go. But I really like Will Wheaton as a narrator, so I'm kind of inching back towards listen to the audiobook again, but we will see when that actually happens. And the last two books I read this month are both from the Morganville Vampire series. The first one was Kiss of Death, which was book 8. This one is actually the favorite so far of the series. Kiss of Death is my favorite story because there is a lot that happens with this. So in the events of Fade Out, actually, what happens is that there's a point where Michael is going to be performing in town, and performs for the entire town, and one of the students at the college in Morganville has her father come out to listen to Michael play, and he's a recording executive in Dallas, and he really likes what Michael is doing and says, hey, I'd like for you to come out and make a demo CD and maybe play a few shows in Dallas if you'd be up for it. Kiss of Death is essentially the story of Michael, Eve, Shane, and Claire getting out of Morganville for the first time for some of them ever in their life, and essentially all the shenanigans that happens when they leave town. Like, it's not good shenanigans by any means, but it's shenanigans nonetheless. Essentially, they come up with seeing all these people outside of Morganville, and they get attacked, and they're running off to try to protect themselves, and then they come across this town called Black, which we find out is actually a town that Bishop had come through at some point on his way to Morganville and had turned a lot of people there into vampires. And all of these vampires have the same sickness that the vampires in Morganville had, that Claire had helped cure throughout the entire town. And so Claire starts to realize that Bishop has done a lot, and there's actually way more vampires than there ever have been known before, and now we have a whole new town that is essentially having to start from the ground up. So it's a very heavy read in a lot of ways because there's a lot of, you know, uncertainty about whether these guys are going to actually make it through being outside of Morganville, and it really just shows that even outside of Morganville, which seems to be the most dangerous place in the world, no one is safe, it seems like, because Bishop has gone and done a lot before he came to Morganville, and it was not good at all. It's very scary, and it honestly, I was on the edge of my seat, I think, for much of this story because I really didn't know what was going to happen to my characters, and I was really scared that somebody was going to get severely hurt because I don't remember much of what exactly the minute details of the story were. So, but it ended up actually turning out to be really interesting, and I felt like especially the idea of the new town of vampires was a really interesting idea because it does show that, you know, this stuff is spreading, and we have to be more cognizant of, you know, the fact that there are other vampires out there. And I think that there is a point where we come back to Black at some point, or characters from the town of Black show up again later in the series, but I cannot remember when that is for the life of me. But I really liked a lot of this, and you can hear my more in-depth thoughts in the last vlog I did, because this was where I ended my reading vlog catch-up of the Morganville Vampires, as this was my October pick. So I really loved it. This is, like I said, the favorite of them so far, and it was scary. It was very, very scary. I was having a hard time keeping myself under control because I didn't want anyone to get hurt. Severely, at least. And the last book I completed at the end of November, almost at like 8:30, 9 o'clock at night last night, was Ghost Town, which was my November pick for the Morganville Vampires reread. So this one follows almost immediately after the events of Kiss of Death. The main thing with this one is that in Fade Out, what happens is that the machine that is running the town dies. It's something that happens in Fade Out that directly affects this story here. And in this story, Claire and Myrnin are trying to figure out how to bring back up the system by not using something that they've done before, which was using Ada. Ada is no longer around, and Claire's trying to find out exactly how to create the system that creates the portals in the world and keeps the barriers of the town up, because the machine essentially has the town be able to wipe the memories of people that leave town so that they don't remember about the vampires, and the portals within the world allow people to actually move from place to place within the town. So they're very important, especially for the vampires. So there's a lot of trying to figure out what's going on. And when they find out a way to actually get the town back up and running again, unfortunately it is with a major consequence, which is that people start to lose their memories. People start actually reverting back to who they were sometimes 3, maybe 5 years prior to the actual time of the story. So Shane and Eve and Michael start to forget that Claire is even someone they know. Michael forgets that he is a vampire. Like, so many things are forgotten about what's really going on in the town, and it's affecting both humans and vampires. And so it is a major problem, because people are starting to die, people are starting to have serious mental problems because of all of this, and it is taking Claire everything in her power to try to fix this, and it is sometimes even harder for her to move through town knowing that there are some people who don't know who she is, that she has been friends with for a very, very long time at this point. And so it is one of the stories where I was really heartbroken throughout a lot of points in it, because of the fact that people were forgetting Claire, and that she'd done so much in the last couple of years that she's been in Morganville. And so it was one of those stories where I just felt like at every turn my heart was breaking even more for her because of people that were forgetting her. I don't think this is beat Kiss of Death by any means as the favorite, but this is definitely a close second, because I felt like the story was so much more scary. Like, this is, I feel like, a point in the series where everything becomes even scarier than it used to be. Like, Kiss of Death is a big turning point in the overall tone of the series, and Ghost Town exasperates that tone to a high extent and really showcases that there is a lot that is wrong with this town, and it showcases that Claire is really pretty much the only thing actually keeping this town together anymore. And the ending events of this story definitely lead to that, because Claire ends up becoming a little bit more powerful in some instances than she used to be. So it's quite a huge turn, I think, for her in a lot of ways. But I am actually going to be having a review for this book later. By the time this video goes out, it should be coming out soon, so keep your eyes peeled for a more in-depth review of Ghost Town, because I will have a lot to say about it. So there you guys go. Those are all the books I actually ended up finishing in the month of November. Like I said, it was quite a few. Like, I read like 14 out of the 20 books I really had, and I think that going into December, I'm going to take a little bit more time with the audiobooks I do have, so I'm going to like space them out a little bit differently so I'm not overrunning myself like I used to. And I don't know, maybe that means I only go back to listening to one audiobook a month. Maybe I listen to a couple. I don't really know, but December is going to be a really crazy month for me, because I have the Winter Quest readathon going on in the beginning. I have coming up this weekend a family Christmas party, and I'm going to a concert with Robert. I also, next week on the 13th, I'm getting my wisdom teeth removed, so I'm going to be out of commission for probably about maybe a week or so that's going to be interesting. And then I've got Christmas that is also coming up, so it's going to be a crazy month. But anyway, let me know what you guys ended up reading in November, if you liked anything, if you read anything that I've been reading, and what your thoughts were on any of the books I had. So thank you guys so much for joining me in this video. If you guys did enjoy it, please do give it a big thumbs up. And if you're not already and you'd like to be, hit that button down below and subscribe to become an owlet in our flock. And I will see all of you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.